Prynhawn da. It's good to virtually see everyone. And it's a pleasure to be chairing this panel this afternoon as well. So my name is Mike Dowell. I'm Deputy Director Marine and Fisheries in the Welsh Government, and so have a strong interest in today's topic. And we're talking about policy and planning to support ocean energy mitigation for climate change. So a big topic, looking forward to the panel presentations as well as the discussion that follows. So I guess just a bit of housekeeping for all our sort of speakers and panelists, remembering to unmute yourselves and mute yourselves, before and during, before and after your presentations. And then also just to encourage everybody who's entering this session and listening and watching to get involved in the chat, send through, good testing questions, get the debate going, and that would be really good. So I've introduced myself. I will introduce the panel, and then we'll be getting into the presentations. And then I think I should say that as each presenter comes in and gives their presentation, if you could also sort of introduce yourselves as well. So we'll go for a double whammy in that respect. But it was just to say, this session, so Wales was the first country in the world to legally pass a climate emergency and to deliver on Wales's ambitions. An innovative approach to policy planning and collaboration will be required. So this session is to look at current plans, lessons learned from elsewhere, and what the future could look like. So that's what we're tackling this afternoon. Right, if I just switch a screen here so I can lead you through who we've got on the panel this afternoon. So we have James Moon, who's our lead specialist advisor, Offshore Renewable Energy Programme at Natural Resource Wales. We have Ruth De Silva, Principal Marine Consultant at RPS. Jim Mckee, Chair of the Consenting Strategic Advisory Group. I should have just gone with Csag, but that wouldn't be fair on everyone watching. So good to see you, Jim, Chair of that group. Mike Williams, Programme Director, Local Partnerships at the Welsh Government. And Helen Donovan, Senior Industrial Transformation Manager, also here at Welsh Government. So we're going to move into the presentations now. And I believe, James, you're first up. You get the pleasure of being first this afternoon.
Thanks, Mike.
So without further ado, I will step back and mute myself and hand over to James.
Thanks, Mike. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Moon. I manage NRW's Offshore Renewable Energy Programme. So thanks to Marine Energy Wales for inviting me on the panel today. The focus of my presentation will be on the Offshore Renewable Energy Programme and the steps NRW are taking to help support the sector and to help tackle the climate and nature emergencies. So firstly, it's important to look at the policy context of renewable energy development in Wales. The extract at the top of the slide was taken from the joint NRW Welsh Government Marine Evidence Strategy, and I think it frames nicely the context behind what we're trying to achieve. Essentially, the sustainable management of natural resources to ensure that we meet emissions targets, but also maintain a healthy and resilient marine environment. The Welsh Government have also set clear targets for decarbonisation in Wales, and this is further supported by the policy documents I've linked on the slide here. In addition, the COVID emergency has led to a renewed focus because of the dramatic impact on the economy. And in order to help stimulate growth, the Welsh Government have launched a post-COVID green recovery. And tackling the climate emergency through expansion of the renewable sector is central to this ambition. We heard from Leslie Griffiths this morning, but I have included a quote from the Minister at the bottom of the slide, which I think nicely summarises Welsh Government's intent with the green recovery. So now I'll provide an overview of NRW's Offshore Renewable Energy Programme and its purpose. The OREP was established last year as a direct response to increasing political, public and policy interest in Wales around offshore renewable energy. As I mentioned in the previous slide, this growth is driven by ambitious decarbonisation goals, a move towards a low carbon economy and a declaration of a climate emergency. The final Welsh National Marine Plan clearly identifies marine renewables as a priority, with the objective to contribute significantly to the decarbonisation of our economy and to our prosperity by increasing the amount of marine renewable energy generated. In addition, the availability of European structural funds for marine energy has provided a welcome financial boost to the industry in Wales. The aim of OREP is to provide integrated delivery across all of NRW's marine remit. This includes our role as a statutory advisor and regulator, And the programme covers all renewable sectors, including wave and tidal stream, tidal range, floating offshore wind and fixed offshore wind. Through the programme, we have now increased our staff resource across 6 marine teams in NRW to cover advice, policy, regulation and evidence and guidance development as well. A number of my colleagues are here today and will be with us for the rest of the conference. Sorry. So in the next 2 slides, I've highlighted the key work areas under the Offshore Renewable Energy Programme, including some brief summaries of our remit. And behind the scenes, the OREP team are making some great progress in these key work areas. At present, we are advising on multiple offshore renewable energy cases spanning the full breadth of the sectors I mentioned previously, from offshore wind and floating offshore wind to wave and tidal stream and tidal range. Most recently, we have consented the Marine Energy Test Area project led by Marine Energy Wales, and Ruth De Silva will be talking to you shortly about that. We work really closely with Marine Energy Wales and the consultants on META throughout the marine licence application process. And we particularly welcome the early engagement with NRW technical specialists to help shape the project and to ensure that test devices can be deployed without the detrimental effects upon the environment. At a more strategic level, we continue to work closely with Welsh Government and our colleagues in other UK administrations to influence policy and provide strategic advice. Most recently, we have responded to the UK Parliamentary Environmental Audit Committee call for evidence on tidal power, and we are currently drafting a response to the Welsh Affairs Committee call for evidence on renewable energy in Wales. Communication liaison with key stakeholders at both the project and strategic level is critical to our work. Jim Mckee will be talking to you shortly about the Consenting Strategic Advisory Group, which brings together industry, regulators and environmental NGOs to help tackle some of the strategic issues for the marine energy sector. And NRW play an active role in Csag and the Science and Evidence subgroup, which has been recently established. Development of evidence and guidance to help support the sector is one of the core roles of OREP. We have started to make progress with some key evidence gaps identified through our own internal marine evidence prioritization process. I'll be talking in more detail about this actually at the Supergen and Orgip Ocean Energy Side event, which is happening on Friday afternoon. So if you'd like to hear more about some of the critical evidence needs for Wales, that will be happening then. In addition, through OREP and our Marine Casework Guidance Project, NRW is delivering guidance to help applicants through the environmental assessment and consenting process. Examples include a publication of bespoke pages on our website, which provide links to relevant guidance, advice, evidence, and data. And I've provided a link to these on the slide here. We are currently preparing guidance on using adaptive management and project phases in marine developments, which will be published soon. And we're also updating our EIA scoping guidance as well. So hopefully the last few slides has given you a flavour of some of the work we're involved with. And as you can see, marine renewable energy is a high priority for NRW. So my final slide looks a little bit at what the future may hold. So NRW's Offshore Renewable Energy Programme is set to continue until at least 2023, and hopefully beyond as the sector expands and the demands on NRW continue to grow. We will continue to be active across all the sectors that I mentioned previously, at both a strategic and project level. And for us, it's critical to learn lessons from previous applications and consented projects to look at what worked well and what we can do better. We can then use this learning to disseminate best practice through our guidance. Improving our knowledge and evidence base and developing our understanding of how renewable energy devices interact with the marine environment is critical to the expansion of the renewable sector in Wales. As test and demonstration projects receive consent and get devices in the water, we need to make the most of these opportunities to learn and build evidence of how those technologies interact with the environment, so that we are better prepared for scaling up to arrays in the future. I'm sure over the next few talks you'll hear that a collaborative approach is essential if we are to deliver on these ambitions, and NRW are committed to working with partners to achieve these goals. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the Offshore Renewable Energy Programme and some of the progress that we're making. Thanks for listening, and any questions I can answer in the panel discussion at the end.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. Hang on, I'm just going to have to cough again. There we go. Right. Well, without further ado, we've got Ruth up next, Ruth De Silva, Principal Marine Consultant at RPS. And I was just going to say, James, excellent time there as well. So I'm not having to do any policing thus far. So over to you, Ruth.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. So I am Ruth De Silva, and I'm a Principal Consultant at RPS. RPS was the lead EIA consultant supporting Marine Energy Wales on the consenting of the META project, including the development of the PDE, the consenting strategy, the EIA and HRA, and of course, consent applications. So the focus of my presentation is on the key challenges that we came across and the lessons learned from supporting Marine Energy Wales through this process. So the META project is a series of 8 pre-consenting non-grid connected test areas in the Milford Haven waterway and nearby waters. And the test sites are suitable for a range of instrument component subassembly and marine energy device testing, including offshore floating wind. In consenting the META project, there were 3 key challenges I wanted to share with you, the first of which was the complex nature of the consenting environment. A 2-phase approach to consenting the sites was agreed due to the significant differences in the nature and scale of the testing proposed at the META project sites. So you can see in the little box there in the middle of the figure, these are the META phase 1 sites, and they're all in the port of Milford Haven. So focus of these sites was very much on small scale and short-term testing and research projects. So there was a simpler consenting environment with only 4 licenses or permissions required, and there was no EIA requirement. However, phase 2, which you can see are the 3 sites, the largest of which is East Pickard Bay there on the left-hand side of that figure. These were all either in the Milford Haven waterway or nearby. And the focus of testing at these sites was on larger scale testing, including full-scale devices and the floating offshore wind farm platforms. So these sites all required 6 licenses or permissions and up to 2 different regulatory authorities for town and country planning alone. And a full EIA was required for all of phase 2 sites. So key challenge was consenting the 2 phases at the same time with different licensing requirements resulted in multiple stakeholders, multiple consent applications and multiple documentation requirements. So really quite complex. So agreeing a clear and focused consenting strategy right at the outset with our key stakeholders was absolutely key to progressing these applications. And also agreeing key points of contact and communication channels with these stakeholders ensured a kind of streamlined and efficient engagement process. So the second key challenge to share with you is that there were changes in regulatory jurisdiction part way through the project in terms of section 36. And also there were changes to key points of contact in some of our statutory and key stakeholders. So section 36 changed from, the jurisdiction for it changed from the MMO to the Welsh Government quite late on in the consenting phase, which led to quite a degree of uncertainty in what consenting was required and also what engagement was required. And then also with the changes in key stakeholder contacts several times throughout the consenting phase, this led to potential changes in stakeholder advice on key aspects of the project and potential delays to programme as the new staff got up to speed on the project. So again, agreeing lines of communication with key stakeholders was absolutely critical to progressing discussions during the consenting phase, particularly on very important aspects such as ornithology and benthic ecology. And a focused and very well documented stakeholder engagement strategy allowed consenting phase discussions to progress despite the changes in stakeholders. The third key challenge here was that there were a few changes to the phase 2 project description over the consenting phase of the project. So a key aim of the META project was to provide testing facilities and therefore a testing project design envelope that had enough flexibility in it to support a range of developer testing needs whilst also supporting EIA and HRA for phase 2 and for multiple consent applications. And there were several changes in the phase 2 project design envelope in the consenting phase, including removal of onshore works and removal of marine cable to shore. So these changes led to potential delays in the project programme and the need to increase engagement with SNCBs to determine if any alterations in the project design altered their advice on the project. So early agreement on the communication channels was key to discussing and agreeing these potential changes in stakeholder advice as a result of the PDE, and also how that could or would not affect the project. And absolutely critically, a willingness from all parties to agree a way forward and to demonstrate flexibility and a practical approach to agreeing project design envelope changes or consent conditions was critical to achieving consent in the end. And then finally, Marine Energy Wales have asked me to share some experiences from my previous work as a statutory stakeholder when I worked for SNH, also having worked for the consultancy environment, the developer side of things, and also having worked in most of the countries in the UK on marine energy projects. So though there can be differences in project-specific regulations and therefore the need for specific advice on projects, the routes to potential impact are largely common throughout UK waters. Therefore, there is a large amount of sharing, I feel, that can be brought between statutory stakeholders and their advisors throughout the UK to agree consenting approaches, for example, or also, very importantly, research priorities. And in terms of research priorities, for example, what they are and how they're going to be achieved, I think is fundamentally important to the industry moving forwards. And this will all help agreeing a proportionate approach to EIA for projects, which is key to getting devices in the water and for all of us to learn from getting those developments progressed. All of these steps will help the industry making significant contributions to tackling climate change and achieving strategic and policy goals. I will hand back now to Mike and happy to take questions in this panel discussion at the end.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And again, another excellent presentation and excellently on time. So things are going very smoothly, and just very interesting sort of where you left off there in your presentation around that that point about the synergies that might be had between sort of different regulatory administrations. So I'm sure there'll be some questions on that coming up when we get to that part of the session. Right, I digress. So next up is Jim. So Jim, you're coming in next. You're chair of the Consenting Strategic Advisory Group. So over to you. Just checking, Jim. You might need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, my sincere apologies. That's exactly what I did. I will now try again. I was trying to be too clever, Mike. That doesn't look good, but that's being as it was.
No, I think you're just being too kind. You know, someone has to do that first. So you've now done that. You've done that for everybody, which is great. So you've done us a service. Thanks,
No
Jim.
problem. Thanks, Mike. I'm assuming that you can see my presentation. My apologies for asking such a simple question.
Yes, we can see it. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much to James and Ruth for the nice lead into my presentation. My presentation is a very high level one, so that was really helpful. So my name's Jim Mckee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm a retired Marine Scotland regulator with 46 years experience working in the marine environment. 30 of those years very pleasantly in marine regulation, and a big part of that time was spent in wave, wind and tide projects in the Scottish marine area. Since my retirement in 2018, I've been involved in providing advice on offshore wind and MRE developments in Wales and Scotland. I've chaired Csag for a year, and I just wanted to provide you with a summary of Csag's work at this present time. Okay. My apologies, acronyms, but fundamentally Csag, as you can see, is the Consenting Strategic Advisory Group, and CGIP is the Science and Evidence Advisory Group. Welsh ministers continue to underline their commitment to the responsible development of renewable energy devices by fully supporting the establishment of Csag and CGIP, and most importantly their work. the absolute necessity remains to balance the use of marine environment whilst protecting its value and unique biodiversity and ecology. Csag and CGIP's membership works collaboratively, which is vitally important. Members include the representatives from the MRE industry, regulators, advisors, and crucially for its success, the RSPB, the Wildlife Trusts, and Whale and Dolphin Conservation. Catapult, Crown Estate, and ORGIP are fundamental representatives as well, and they attend. Currently, the groups are focused on environmental matters and those stakeholders, but we're very keen to be able to branch out and eventually branch out to connect with other marine stakeholders and interested parties. So identifying the challenges is one of the key aspects to facilitate timely decision making. So a little bit about why whales. Let's remind ourselves. In addition to the diverse marine energy resources, it supports its skills, the people, the supply chain. We importantly have the support of the government and ministers. This support is consolidated through the National Marine Plan and a plethora of underpinning policies, initiatives, studies, and support measures. Wales has a purposeful planning and consenting framework which strives to be proportionate whilst requiring the right level of detail and evidence to make decisions. Wales, like many countries, has a range of decision-making bodies, inevitably. However, it is keen to work collaboratively across the processes to provide a clear pathway. It's vital for the industry that timely and robust decisions are made. So a little bit about Csag and CGIP. As indicated earlier, we have clear goals and work programs to identify and facilitate the use of best practice, whilst recognising best available evidence and science, all of which critically underpins decision making. The membership follows a balanced and collaborative strategy to identify routes targeted to help reduce the regulatory and environmental risks. One of the key aspects is the group's ability to address matters in a balanced and, indeed, I repeat the word, collaborative manner, identifying and accessing available evidence from numerous sources, whilst bringing forward, using their vast experience, their own evidence. So it's important to understand a sound and accessible evidence base is critical to support the MRE sector and understand the health of the seas while supporting sustainable development. So a short snapshot of the actions and priorities. You can appreciate there's been a great deal done to date and still much to do. So you will see for yourself the progress being made. I've highlighted those aspects which are the progress aspects in green. However, it is worthwhile bearing in mind the significant and time-consuming challenges we face and the effort and resource required from what is not an endless supply, especially with the added pressures we have all faced in the last year. Some of our initial and still very much current priorities must be addressed, like the cumulative impacts, data sharing, but we also have made good progress on the establishment of, for example, the NRW Offshore Renewable Energy Programme that James mentioned, and also providing views and guidance and access to online tools. Again, something that James mentioned there as being important to delivering his work. Providing clear views and on targeted strategic research and studies is also vitally important and something that's very much foremost in our minds. So essentially, a comprehensive package which is interlinked of measures are in place to support the decision-making process, the industry and the stakeholders. So, in a sort of broad brush summary, Csag has so far established itself delivering on its work plan and priority list, and in response to important drivers set up CGIP to focus on science and evidence needs. The groups draw from their collective experiences and knowledge, and importantly, making the most of published information and pointing out learning opportunities, something which is importantly mentioned by Ruth. The future will remain challenging, and we fully expect to continue to deliver whilst utilising the collaboration support of its members, ministers, and Welsh Government to make Wales a place to develop a sustainable environment, environmentally compliant and responsible MRE industry. CGIP will continue to consolidate their position to identifying and unlocking the opportunities to de-risk the challenges. Thank you, and I no doubt will get questions later, and that's just a short list of useful sources of information.
Thank you ever so much, Jim. Excellent stuff. And before I turn to Mike Williams, Programme Director of Local Partnerships in Welsh Government, I was just going to say, I can see there's a ton of people. It's great in this session. I can see your names and your occupations in this fantastic website that we're working off. Let's ask some questions. You know, these panelists, they're waiting for it. So don't be shy. Get things up in the chat bar. You know, there's a lot to talk about in this area. So let's get going on the questions. Right, Mike, over to you.
Can you see and hear me? I can't see anything out there.
Certainly can. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity to introduce the Welsh Government's Marine Energy Programme. I've been involved in the marine energy sector for about 18 months, and I think it's fantastic. It's diverse, dynamic, enthusiastic, and innovative. So my name is Mike Williams. I'm a Programme Director at Local Partnerships. Local Partnerships is a public sector organisation. We only work for the public sector, and it's jointly owned by the Welsh Government, the Treasury, and the Local Government Association. And we tend to act as in-house consultants to the public sector. And in this case, we're working with the Welsh Government. So as you know, there is a huge potential for marine energy in Wales. It's a low carbon energy source, which would support the Wales's route to net zero. It also has the potential to generate high quality jobs, business development, business growth, and export potential. But there are significant risks that the benefits will not be realised. The programme objective is to maximise the socio-economic and environmental benefits to Wales from the marine energy opportunity. So the Marine Energy Programme, this is a Welsh Government programme led by Jasper Roberts, who'll be speaking to the conference on Friday morning. It has strong political endorsement, and the programme, as you can see from the schematic, has two key work streams. There's the Tidal Lagoon Challenge, and this is led by S.J. Lewis, and the Nascent Marine Benefits Realisation Strategy, led by Jim Scopes, both colleagues of mine at Local Partnerships.
Mike, just to jump in there, the slide hasn't moved on, so I don't know whether that's a system thing or just
how's that?
Just to let you know. Yep, there you go. Perfect.
Fantastic. I think that was personal incompetence rather than system incompetence. But thanks for letting me know. Okay, so hopefully I'm on the right slide. Starting with Tidal Lagoon Challenge, the Welsh ministers are very supportive of tidal lagoons, and there are a number of proposed schemes around the Welsh coast. The aim of the Tidal Lagoon Challenge is to devise an appropriate and affordable support package to stimulate the development and delivery of a Welsh tidal lagoon infrastructure project. And the aims are to test the economic viability, environmental acceptability, and test the technical challenges, and potentially to kickstart a new business sector in Wales. So the challenge will be an iterative process with embedded decision gates at each stage. We're coming to the end of the first stage, which is an informal market engagement. We had a very enthusiastic response from an interesting mix of schemes. We're now procuring technical advisors to support us, and we'll be undertaking soft market testing in March, and this will be used to develop and justify the Welsh Government financial support package and help design the competition to make it as effective as possible, and this will occur throughout the summer. The competition preparation and launch is likely to occur in autumn, with its conclusion and appointment of a delivery partner probably in late 2022. And this will ideally lead to surveys being undertaken with consenting ahead of the infrastructure construction phase. And a key element of this will be high levels of Welsh content. Onto the nascent marine energy side, we're developing a benefits realisation strategy. And in the case of this work, nascent marine refers to tidal stream, wave and floating offshore wind. The aim is to try to ensure that the full potential socioeconomic as well as low carbon energy benefit from the deployment of these technologies is realised and retained by Wales. And the work stream is still at an early stage. We're working with the sector and colleagues such as Helen Donovan and the Welsh Government to get a full understanding of the various elements of the sector. And the slide sets out the broad process that we're going through. Oops, wrong slide. So the first stage is the development of the systems map, and this is to map the sector to identify the opportunities and barriers, and issues and risks. And so this is the systems map. Apologies for its illegibility. I don't expect you to be able to read it, and I expect it looks like a bit of a random mess. Somebody said to me it looks a little bit like a brain, which I think is a lot more positive. It's actually a very useful tool that it's been built on interviews and tested quite widely with key sector stakeholders in Wales, and it highlights the critical elements within the marine energy system and their causal relationships and interdependencies. We've been using the tool to understand the key areas for potential intervention. We know the potential socioeconomic and environmental benefits are huge, but only if the schemes are successfully deployed. The identified threats are significant and challenging, and some of the emerging issues we've identified include the need for revenue support, potentially insufficient port infrastructure, and consenting timetable. And to address one of these, we're actively looking at the design of a potential Welsh revenue support model for tidal stream and wave, and we'll be addressing the other issues in due course. So thank you very much for your time, and apologies for the rapid canter through the presentation. And if anyone would like to know more or feel they'd like to engage with or contribute to the programme, then please do get in touch. Diolch.
Thank you very much, Mike. Right, we got one presentation left from Helen Donovan, Senior Industrial Transformation Manager, Welsh Government. So just before I hand over to you, Helen, it was just to say thank you to Saul and Jessica, who have started the questioning. It's starting to come in the sidebar there, so that's really good to see. Panelists, you can be starting to get your eyes on those because they might be coming your way. So without further ado, Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. I hope everything is clear on the screen there, but I think it's...
Sorry, Helen, just before we start, if you can change it from presenter view, it's just gone back.
Is it gone back again?
Yeah, so if you go in the display settings.
I've just switched it there. Has it worked?
Yes, perfect. That's perfect. Thanks, Helen.
That's great. Thank you. I wanted to come along today and build on what we've heard regarding the fundamentals across the environmental sort of planning, regulation, and licensing side. I'm Helen Donovan. I work within the Department of Economy and Transport within the Industrial Transformation Division. So my sort of focus on the sector is looking at economic benefit and economic infrastructure that needs to be put into place and how it interacts between the technology, the project developers, and to talk about next steps and focusing on the true commercialization and benefits from that, and trying to realize what is the prize that we're aiming for in Wales, and trying to realize that. more than anything else. I think the challenge for us is to fully realise the economic opportunity from our natural resources in such a way that we preserve the natural beauty around us, but achieve sustainable high quality employment across Wales, and dare I say it, in some regions of Wales such as the southwest and the northwest that really need that sort of high quality employment to move their regional economies forward. And also working closely with partners, be it in the southwest of England on floating offshore wind, as well as the Republic of Ireland as well. And we also need to acknowledge that each technology will commercialise over different timescales, and which is important to recognise. So at the moment, we've got an opportunity with offshore wind in North Wales, then moving along to floating offshore wind, primarily in the Celtic Sea, off the coast of southwest of Wales, but also an opportunity off the North Wales coast in some areas as well, then moving along to tidal stream and then wave. And I think what is interesting is the overlap in the infrastructure requirements that need to be put into place, and the likely support mechanisms are interrelated as well, as I'd like to sort of touch on here. I know the Minister this morning talked about the contracts for difference. It was a very positive move that wave and tidal stream were definitely put in there. Obviously, with the UK 10-point plan, very much a focus on offshore wind, and they've set a target there of 40 gigawatts, which included a 1 gigawatt target for floating offshore wind, which is also put into the emerging technologies pot, which is great that you've got that starting point in there. But I think there is still a little bit of a question mark around wave and tidal stream in particular, and how we take that forward. And it needs to be an integrated piece with UK government and all the other devolved administrations in that particular area. I think the CFD mechanism has really been a positive one for the UK in many extent in terms of the offshore wind sort of sector. Over the last 15 years, that has demonstrated its effectiveness in bringing down the levelized cost of energy, and to a point now that it's on a par with the likes of gas-powered stations, for instance. And what I'm hoping for, that this type of support can be replicated across other emerging technologies to ensure that we truly achieve net zero, and not just looking at cost, but also looking at value here as well. So to ensure that local businesses can actually benefit from the growth of these emerging industries. We've been very fortunate in Wales with the €100 million fund that we've had focused on marine, that a lot of our project developers have utilised existing engineering and consulting skills that we have in Wales, and some of those projects have maintained a 70% plus sort of supply chain value within Wales, which is an excellent sort of reflection on the skills that we have here. And I think the challenge for us really going forward is ensuring that the supply chain and the associated skills grow with the sector over the next 10 to 15 years, as well as ensuring that we have the physical infrastructure here to support that. So I know that Miriam Noonan in the previous sort of session talked about the joint work between Welsh Government and the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, looking at port infrastructure and grid infrastructure. These are critical elements going forward, and it's important that everything is put into place, and that is from private investment from the ports themselves through to Welsh Government and UK Government And I think the reports will give us a steer in the right direction of where we need to go going forward. In terms of the innovation side at the moment, we are at a little bit of a crossroads. Where we have our Smart Cymru programme for very early stage sort of innovation projects. We're still to hear from the Shared Prosperity Fund what the focus will be on that going forward. I'm hoping that obviously industrial decarbonisation and renewable energy will be part of that sort of side of things, and we're waiting for final confirmation on our engagement within Horizon. We've been told that that is obviously on the table here going forward, but I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit more detail over the next month for us to start really moving forward in a positive fashion, because a number of our companies have actually engaged with that particular program going forward. So to sort of wrap up in terms of what are the economic benefits that we're looking to achieve with a lot of the work that's been put in place by Mike's team in terms of the marine and fisheries, getting that regulation and licensing and evidence base together, is that we want to obviously retain the technology companies and the IP that we have in Wales, and put a whole economic wrap around that, so we can help them grow in the future and retain that benefit here in Wales. I think the ports and regional economic opportunity, both North and South Wales, is considerable, and we need to look at that and how we build on that over the next 5 years. And I think the transportation consultation that was completed at the beginning of this week will hopefully be transformational in that area, in setting a strategic direction for port infrastructure there. Also the supply chain, and my focus is very much looking at what we've got here at the moment. What are the possibilities going forward, which I think is key. We have a very large base of engineering companies within the oil and gas sector, engineering within automotive as well as aerospace. What are the diversification opportunities for those businesses to look to the future and become a lot more sustainable with the changes in some of the economies here and the subsectors itself. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves. There will be supply chain gaps that we need to fill, and we've had that sort of feedback in terms of the work that we've done with the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult already on floating offshore wind, and we need to work very closely there to identify what the opportunities are and engage with the right type of investors to benefit the whole of Wales. That is a massive sort of topic area all in itself that I've rattled through over the last couple of minutes. So really happy to take questions as part of the panel, but also to mention I'm part of the booth with Welsh Government, so come over and have a chat. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Helen. I like the idea of that booth. That sounds great. And look, thank you to all of you. Thank you to all of our panelists for the presentations so far this afternoon. So whilst they catch their breath, have a glass of water, drink of water or whatever it is, before we head into the Q&A, it was just to say that, just to remind everybody, because I can see there's been people pouring into this session ever since it began, which is great. So good numbers there, really diverse audience, and we've got some good questions coming through in the sidebar already. So just to remind ourselves, because we've had these presentations and a lot of the questions are sort of focused on the presentations themselves, which is fine, that's great. But this is also a session on policy and planning to support ocean energy mitigation for climate change. So that's the session we're in. So do feel free to ask questions that, you know, a bit more umbrella, perhaps, that look towards that kind of policy challenge and the role that planning might play in it. So there you go, a bit of a challenge to the audience there too. Right. So I'm just having a look, and I think I'm going to bring forward, it was in fact the first question we had come through from Saul Young, So I'm going to bring that through to the panelists, and it's directed at you, James. But actually, I think that, you know, whilst we'll sort of start with you, James, it's probably a question that I think, you know, others in the panel could pick up on, because it's around adaptive management. And so Saul's asked, you know, please could you talk more about this and what that looks like in practice. So I think that would be really helpful if you just gave a really quick explanation of what adaptive management is, and then, you know, yeah, what that looks like in practice. And then if any of the other panelists want to come in, we can do that. So over to you,
sure. No problem, Mike. Yeah, so adaptive management, I suppose, is essentially a tool. It's a consenting tool for managing uncertainty for those projects that have potential environmental impacts that we're still more uncertain of, and we need to monitor the devices in the water to see how they respond to the environmental conditions. So it's essentially a phased consent. So you may want to start phasing with a number of small devices initially, monitor those, and then look at that monitoring to see how it's behaving, see how marine mammals interact with that device, for example, and then gateways are built into the adaptive management process, so that information is then reviewed, and then if all parties agree, then you can move on to the next phase, and so on. As I said in my presentation, we're currently writing some guidance on adaptive management for consenting and phase consenting. And that's going to be on the NRW website soon, actually. It's already been shared with Csag members, and they've had time to comment as well. So that's kind of some of it. It's really to manage uncertainty and try and reduce consenting risk.
Thanks very much, James. Would anyone else like to just comment on the toolbox? Ruth, I can see your hand up.
Okay, yeah, just to bring a bit of experience in from Scotland, and Jim, you might want to weigh in on this one, but back in the day, so I used to work for SNH for about 10 years before I moved into the consultancy world. And at that point, it was really quite early on in the marine renewables development sector, where I worked very closely with the likes of Mckee. And at that point, we started to develop the deploy and monitor strategy, which some of you might have heard of, but it was effectively just what James is talking about, is we need to get devices in the water in order to learn about what those potential impacts are to reduce that level of uncertainty. And the deploy and monitor strategy was very much focused on wave and tidal development, but it was also cognizant of European requirements in terms of HRA, and the level of certainty is required around that process as well, so not just EIA as well, EIA and HRA. And I think a lot of learning can be transferred from the development of that policy to other countries, and how it was actually implemented, starting with smaller developments and building up to larger developments.
Mike, Ruth,
yeah,
thank you very much. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. James is aware of the background to this, so I gave a bit of an overview at a Csag meeting, and you're quite right. And the thing about it was that the Scottish Government endorsed the what was called Survey, Deploy and Monitor, but you know there's select connotations in that through policy support. So it was signed off as being a matter that was very important to the Scottish Government's consideration of, and it was particularly for MRE projects, albeit there were other things that one could have applied it to. And it was interesting because in the initial concepts and discussions around it, the view was it was a way of managing everything that we're trying to be challenged on in Wales. It was a way of complying entirely with all the relevant regulation. But more importantly, it was introducing the concept and necessity to start small and build big, build out bigger, not particularly big, but bigger. I think it equally gave opportunities to the industry to be able to kickstart their projects and give them the impetus to drive forward, when sometimes it was quite difficult to do, because if your prospect was building one device, but yet you wanted to build 20 devices, you know, it was a bit hard sell. So I think, you know, it wouldn't be overstretching it to say the industry would welcome that opportunities as well. So yes, as Ruth says, lots of experience there. I particularly have had some experience of it. We've used it in certain things in the past. So, and James is familiar with that, and colleagues in NRW are also familiar.
Thanks very much,
Worth
Jim.
saying.
Oh, James.
Sorry, Mike. It's also worth saying that adaptive management needs to come along with a robust environmental sort of mitigation plan as well in place, so that if any sort of impacts are detected, then you can change the you can use mitigation to help minimize those impacts going forward. So that's also in there as a sort of management measure to help the adaptive management process.
Yeah, James, absolutely correct. The point is that it's not intended to be, if people are concerned about it being shortcutting, that's not what it's about at all. It is much more than that, and that's vitally important to understand. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just fast forwarding down the track, there's a few other questions sort of related. So don't worry, I'm not going to forget those who've asked questions higher up. But on what we talked through there, is a question from to follow on, and it's about how long would you expect these monitoring projects, for instance, as part of this adaptive management that we've been talking about, how long would you expect these monitoring projects to last? Because there is an inherent sort of tension between, for instance, the immediate rapid need, to move towards net zero with renewable energy and the benefits that can bring, but also obviously it takes time to monitor. It's that's also implicit. So I would just wonder if any of the panelists want to kind of pick up on that chicken and egg scenario.
It is a tough question, to be honest, Mike, because we don't have that many devices in the water yet, and we don't have that monitoring in place. It's hard to say how long that might take. I mean, if you're starting really small and working your way up, then the initial phases might be a year or two of monitoring, and then you can progress to the next phase. So it's if that monitoring works and it's successful, and we're getting good evidence out of that, then you can use that to inform the next phase and so on. And it might be that from those early stages we can infer impacts that learn from that, and for impacts that may occur at a larger array scale, for example. So it is a long process, but I don't think it's to say that it's not going to hinder the achievement of net zero and that kind of thing.
To come in enough, that's okay. What I think the point about this is that we're looking at this in isolation, adaptive management, sub-deployment, monitoring in isolation as an entity. But of course, it comes with a package. There's a package that has to be there to support that, and that's really vitally important. As we said, and we were saying, it's not about cutting corners. It's all about building on what is a good strategic base. If you can do that, is really important. But equally, learning from others and the willingness to be able to take from what you've seen elsewhere and apply it to your circumstances, which is not easy. But it does require a certain degree of confidence in the process and the people and the understanding to move things on. I think the question is a good question, and I think it's an appreciative point, is that how long does it take? What you have to balance it against a very careful judgment about how quickly you move versus how much you understand to make the move. So there's a great deal of thought needs to be applied to it. So not dodging the answer to the question, but small numbers of years sometimes has to be the case. But it may be the case that as time goes by, those time series become smaller. And I think you have to be careful answering the question, because you mustn't unnecessarily raise expectations in a rather unwarranted manner in some ways.
And can I just weigh in there as well, just on a point that I raised in my presentation, is that all of this discussion is absolutely critical, but there needs to be a kind of industry level agreement of what the priority issues are that monitoring, or survey, deploy and monitoring, needs to focus on. So it's not projects that are answering the wider questions, but it's done at a strategic, or in a strategic manner with appropriate funding.
Yeah, if it's okay, Mike, just to come back again, is that okay?
Please do. Yep.
I think that's actually, as you can probably tell, as the audience will tell, there's a great deal that goes around this, and that's why when I mentioned it, and I know and James and Ruth have very carefully also underlined the point, we mustn't take it in isolation. I mean, I'm talking from some level of experience here that there's a great deal needs to go along to support it. The strategic nature of what you've got to put in place is vitally important, but what must come with that is strategic funding. But equally, what you must have is an understanding of where you should focus that investment, not just in terms of funding, but also effort. And it also must be remembered that it's strategic. It's vitally important at the outset to consider these things on a strategic basis, because it's important, it's for the benefit of more than one or two different companies. The companies will benefit, but it's for the Welsh benefit that we need to keep our eye on. But yeah, it's you could talk about this for a very long time, and I guess that's not what we want to do.
No, that's very helpful, and thanks to the three of you for picking that up. And I'm sure we'll come back to it. And I think where you say strategy, I'm also thinking, that's planning as well. There's obviously strategy and planning that is clear. Just to sort of bring Mike and Helen in, because we had a couple of questions earlier, sort of more specific to you. One was from Roger, the other was from Joseph, and it was around. So, for instance, Mike, could you please outline the timetable for your work on the nascent marine? In particular, when are you expecting to have a revenue support mechanism and/or regulatory requirement, for instance, carbon dioxide limits? And then just to wrap up the two questions, so there's that sort of specific bit, and then the other bit, which I'm sure I think applies to Helen as well, is around funding. How does all this fit with existing funds and CFD? So I hope that's okay. Maybe Mike, and then a combination of Mike and Helen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Part of the question I didn't really understand, so I'll talk about the bit I did understand, and then see how we go from there. So the revenue support, that's developed. The idea for that has developed sort of by listening to the needs of the industry as one of the key barriers, given that UK government's CFD scheme wasn't certainly when we started thinking about this, wasn't nearly covering the nascent marine area, and particularly tidal stream and wave. So we wondered what we could, how we could help, what could we do about that, and obviously as a Wales-based solution, and we built on the sort of the ask that was already out there with the IPPA going to an ICFD onto CFD, so an innovative PPA type solution, and wondered, is there something that Welsh Government could do within its powers to sort of solve that problem at the smaller scale? So we started working on what we're kind of using in sort of just code as a quasi CFD, but this would be a grant funded scheme that would mirror a kind of a CFD process, so give the same benefits of that revenue support, but looking at the early sort of pre-commercialisation side. So the first steps of that have been sort of testing it with Welsh Government legal services to see, are there any reasons why the Welsh Government couldn't do something like that, as long as, we were careful not to ask the question, can we do a kind of a CFD thing, because we blatantly can't. So we asked sort of slightly subtly different questions, and under a grant mechanism, we may well be able to craft a grant mechanism to look and feel like a CFD, and therefore deliver the same benefits that the industry wanted to do through the IPPA stage. So again, talking to industry, talking to colleagues at Morelice and things in terms of timescale, the view that we're getting, or the ask that we're getting, is that really the scheme in terms of communication of it needs to be sort of presented as soon as possible and communicated as soon as possible, so that through the sort of the investment and development stages, that this can be factored into the development process, so that the money will be available for the time of deployment. And we've been told that that's sort of maybe 2024, 2023, 2024 time, when it'll be actually needed. And so our aim is to be able to work with Morelice and perhaps even key in with some of their work, so that we don't duplicate any grant application efforts or pre-qualification efforts of the industry, sort of minimizing the burden on them. I hope that sort of answers the question, but happy to response in more specifics if needed.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'll hand to Helen now as well, and I'm sure the chat bar of truth will let you know if you've answered that. So Helen.
Indeed. So if I can just address Kath's Wellard's question in the chat bar there. We've spent an awful lot of time and effort working with Bays and the Crown Estate, particularly over the last 18 months, talking about floating offshore wind, as well as the marine and tidal sort of side of things. I think it's important that we shared our policy focus with them and then set out the evidence, and we've got hard evidence with the work that we've done with the catapult, for instance, on economic benefits and looking at the physical infrastructure that is required. And that was the start of our journey about 18 months ago when we started working with the catapult around those areas, because Bays and the Crown Estate were saying, yeah, you've got a couple of inquiries, what does it mean, so what, almost, because obviously a lot of the focus has been on the East Coast. So we're building an evidence base here that shows that we've got a dynamic relationship with quite a number of big players in this area. We've got work ongoing with Blue Gem Wind, for instance, and I think Simply Blue Energy have announced another sort of partnership this morning for the Irish part of the Celtic Sea as well. We're working with a number of other developers here. So we're building the critical evidence base, which I think provides Bays and the Crown Estate with comfort that we've got that information, and we're taking quite a strategic approach over it. I've mentioned the 2 reports that we're undertaking at the moment. Those are due for completion during February. We're then going to review them. What is in our gift as a Welsh Government to assist with? What do we need to do jointly with the likes of National Grid and with Bays and other sort of actors in this area to see whether we can put a strategic plan together, for the next 5 years. I think the transport consultation will throw out some very interesting pieces of work around port infrastructure in particular, and how we work with our ports, how we collaborate, and how we do it on a strategic basis across, say, the Celtic Sea, for instance. What can we provide in Wales? Recognise potentially we can't provide everything. What relationship and collaboration do our ports in Wales have to have with the southwest of England, with Ireland, for instance, to provide an integrated approach so UK PLC benefits? And that's the way that we're taking it forward. So we've got that critical evidence to influence Bays based on that evidence there going forward. I hope that helps.
Thanks very much, Ellen. And it was just saying, Mike, you're in luck. Positive feedback there from Roger on understanding the timeline for commercial support. So very good.
Fantastic. Got away with it. Good.
Right, and don't worry, I'm jumping around the questions. So those of you who've asked questions, we will obviously try to get around them all. And it was just say, there's a good solid 20-25 minutes left to go. So I think we've got time, which is good. So I guess maybe taking a slightly different tack then, I think it's a great question here from Kat Root Stevens. And so this open to the whole of the panel. And I won't try and summarize it because I think it's been asked as eloquently as it can be. So how can the current regulatory framework deliver on our climate change commitments, as well as those biodiversity aims, which can often conflict? So do conservation objectives need to be amended to allow the flexibility to enable short-term impacts to mitigate those long-term, longer-term gains? It's a great question. It's a big question, I realize that, but just any thoughts from the panel on that? And open to anyone who fancies going first on that, really.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks for that question. That's a cracker. So the regulatory framework as it is, the marine licensing team in NRW have some clear legislation that they have to work with, including the Habitats Directive and Water Framework Directive, amongst others. So the conservation objectives under the Habitats Directives are obviously critical to decision making through the HRA process. I don't know of any moves to change the conservation objectives at present. That would be quite a task. But needless to say, there is other legislation like the Environment Wales Act as well that does have wider sort of goals as well, which the marine licensing team do consider when they weigh up their decision making. So there is that angle, I suppose, and then also in terms of the derogation process as well, and imperative reasons of overriding public interest is that route as well, which can be sought. So yeah, that's not a very good answer, Kat, for your question, because I'm not a regulator, but if anybody else wants to jump in and help me out. Jim, with all your experience.
James. Yes, indeed. Yes, no problem. Okay, I think you are quite right, James. It's an extremely difficult question. You're completely correct. I think that it's, in my opinion, and I'm expressing my opinion, obviously, here, I don't think we ever want to be in a place where we're looking to amend the conservation objectives at all. It's my experience that actually conservation objectives are well founded, but are they always well understood? The answer to that question is, I'll cut to the chase, not always. And I mean that across the piece. Is the regulatory frameworks always fit for purpose? They are proportionally fit for purpose, but they also can and move with the times. And the flexibility to some extent doesn't come from actually making a change to what I regard to be the fundamental rules and regulations. It's about amending and advising and changing and adapting and tweaking the processes that allows you to move through that. But equally, providing the support to be able to to actually answer the questions identified that could be the stumbling block to progress is the right way to go about it. Because I think to try to make the changes, it's just not going to happen. It's like trying to change the regulatory process, the legislation. Folks, I've done that. And those of you around the table probably have been. That is not an easy task. So what we've got to do is, I think we must accept and understand what the true meaning of the conservation regulations are, because there is sufficient movement within those to be able to achieve what Wales wants to do at the moment. But the difficulty is it's not always understood how best to address them and to be able to meet the requirements of them. So I think that's the point we should be focusing on. Are we doing a good job to meet the requirements? The answer to that is not always. The answer then has to be, the question then has to be, so how do we? The answer to that is, well, that's a bit of a challenge. So it is a good question. And I think the point about it is that I think flexibility is something that you can adapt. I would say the flexibility is in the processes that are around that manages and works with the regulations, I think, with the conservation regulations. And I think there are many other things you've also got to take into account for as sure as hell. When you start trying to change something in one area, you run into problems in the other. So let's not try to be too clever. Let's just try to be very logical and continue to go the route we're currently in, providing information, getting the strategy right, tackling the risks, getting things sorted, getting the processes in place, and making the right moves. And I think that's what's quite important. Again, Kat, it's not an easy question to answer because it's difficult to get to the point of the pin, and you can't change the regulation. The conservation, in my opinion, and by the biodiversity regulation. So that kind of takes that point out and has to set it aside, I'm afraid, to a little bit, like parking it for now.
Great. I see not everyone wants to come in. That's good. Just because Mike had his hand up, I'll go to Mike next, but then Ruth, I think you want to come in afterwards. So Mike, then Ruth.
Yeah, so I'm on the asking a question side rather than giving an opinion side. And while we were doing our mapping and interviewing sort of people from a different around the sector, around the industry, there seemed to be, certainly from the developer side, a kind of view, and this certainly chimes with the some of the things you were saying, Jim, I think, is that people looked to Scotland a few years ago and to Canada, for example, and say that things can be done and have been done much faster than they're happening in Wales. And so there seems to be a kind of a confusion as to why that happens, and a worry that Wales is just far too slow or far too cautious, and I've no idea which. And if things can happen much faster in other jurisdictions, is that a function of the interpretation of the regulatory framework, or is that due to the different receiving environments, and therefore the legislation that defines those particular environments, or something else. And if it's in somebody's gift to change the way things are done, whose gift is it?
Mike, yeah, some big questions back out to the audience there. And so it'll be good to see. I mean, because of course you don't just have to ask questions in the chat bar. Our beloved audience, you can also join the debate too. Ruth.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up, I think it kind of covers a little bit about what Jim and Mike have both raised, but it kind of comes back to a point we've discussed already, but I think is very important here, is the lessons that can be learned between devolved nations. So the Habitats Directive overarches all of our habitats regulations. So it's our interpretation, the devolved nations interpretation of the overarching directive. So the fundamentals of what we have to meet are the same. And as Mike just pointed out there have been slightly different ways in which developments have been able to progress in those devolved nations, and therefore there is obviously a huge opportunity for learning from where we've got devices in the water. Again, it does come back to that deploy and monitor point that I raised earlier, because that had to take into account the habitat regulations for Scotland, which have to take into account the Habitat Directive. So that was possible, and we could get devices in the water without having to spend a lot of time before they got wet, basically. So I think it kind of comes full circle to what we were saying at the start of the panel session.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Sorry, I was going to say, before we move on to a different question then, sort of final words from anyone else who'd like to come in from the panel?
Mike, could I just say a quick thing in response to Mike Williams? I think I'm going to use two words. I'm going to use confidence and experience. That's the two words I would leave with you on this particular.
Going to have two rude words then, actually, but
not normally, no.
Yeah, we're way ahead of the watershed so far. But thank you. Yes, confidence and experience. There we go.
I'd like to come in, Mike, if possible. After
yeah, please
Ruth.
do, James. Yep.
So Csag, I think, put a question in about how we're taking the Scottish experience in terms of our decision making. I mean, as a statutory nature conservation body, we're constantly in discussion with our colleagues in the other administrations. We have an industries group with the other bodies and regularly discuss things like conservation objectives and mitigation and monitoring and things like that. So that dialogue is already open. But in terms of projects that are happening in Scotland at the moment, you have projects like Nova Innovation and Maygen, and we're aware of significant developments in those projects in terms of their monitoring, and we're expecting them to report shortly on some of those, particularly around Maygen and the sort of interactions of harbour porpoise with the device. So that will be really helpful and will inform our advice going forward. And also to add to that, working with Offshore Ocean Energy and OES Environmental on the State of Science report, we're also learning from elsewhere in the world, not just in the UK. So there are deployments elsewhere in the world that are doing some really interesting monitoring, coming out with some great results. So I think another plug for the session on Friday afternoon, but the SuperGen Offshore Ocean Energy session is going to be tackling a lot of this. And there'll be some good talks there about how the industry, NRW, NGOs and others can work together to help try and tackle some of these tricky issues. So
thanks very much, James. Right, anyone else? Final thoughts on that particular area before? No, good, excellent. Right, well, sticking with Csag, so thank you for picking that up, James. It saved me a job as well. And also sticking, I guess, in this, taking us back to, policy and planning. So, Csag also asks, how can we work with communities, for instance, on ensuring local ownership? And this was a question sort of directed at Mike and Helen, but others can obviously come in. I was also really nervous when it said Mike and Helen. I thought, I've got no idea. But thankfully, it's not this Mike. So that's good. But also, I guess, so we'll look at that. So how can we work with communities on ensuring local ownership? But also just with that policy planning hat on as well, I'm also going to sort of twin this with a question that Adrian asked earlier as well, which is around the clash between development shoreside infrastructure and the importance of local national heritage assets. So I'm sort of taking that in that planning policy guise. So there's two bits there. It's about the community. So local ownership, which I know has some very specific connotations as well in the energy space, but also that point around, I guess, policy planning tensions. So I don't know who'd like to, maybe Helen, if you're happy to pick this one up first. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. In terms of the question from Adrian, I think we're all very sensitive on that, to be quite honest with you. The areas that will, from an offshore renewable perspective, they're all very sensitive around the coast of Wales, particularly around the southwest. Around the Milford Haven area, around Anglesey itself, and Bodlewyddan, St Asaph, and that sort of area. We're all very conscious there's some beautiful assets there that we don't want to ruin, and we want to take a strategic approach. We're working with the likes of BEIS, with their offshore transmission network group, to see what lessons we can learn from the East Coast. They've got a bit of a spaghetti junction almost, with some of the big offshore wind projects that they have there. We're trying to learn from what they're doing and applying some of that learning to Wales. We appreciate that we've got several projects that are quite near term. So we're pushing all of the developers to work constructively and positively with the local community organisations as well, which I think will be key in that particular area. In terms of the local ownership sort of side of things, energy policy colleagues are doing a piece of work here at the moment, and they're looking at low-hanging fruit. So they've got a site within for onshore wind that they're looking at different models that potentially could look at a local ownership model, because I think it is important to try and encourage some of that money to be flushed around the system in Wales, rather than it going back to some very large sort of organisation that is headquartered elsewhere. So we're very keen on that, and there's some work being undertaken at the moment.
Mike, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I agree with what Helen's said, and there is a local Welsh government local ownership policy. So I think all new renewable projects in Wales now have to have an element of local ownership. The definition of local ownership includes public ownership, so that could include engagement from local authorities as well as the Welsh government itself. Having spoken to some large developers, those who are perhaps looking at large fixed wind facilities, I think they would probably be very, very cautious about allowing public ownership in their schemes when the funding and financing of these are so complex. But they're more open perhaps to some of the early floating developments, and with regard to stuff such as sort of the off Anglesey and the tidal stream, I know Morlice, who are putting a cable in across the island, are interested in the possibility of local offtake at local sort of business hubs, and then of course there's the possibility of hydrogen production, which could have local economic uses in the future, and again sort of could be engaged with local communities on these type of schemes. And I think finally there have been share options, and these type of schemes that have occurred for the public on various platforms, both in onshore wind, but recently several for the offshore renewables. I'm trying to think whether it was Orbital who've just successfully closed a deal where they had a lot of public procurement and share schemes on their latest development. I don't know how they ring fence that to local, or whether it was just the wider public.
Thanks very much, Mike. Anyone else from the panel want to sort of come in or comment on this particular bit? Not for now, that's fine. So I was just going to say, we're just shy of 10 minutes to go now. And it's good, the questions have been flowing, so that's been great. And I think I was just going to turn to a question here from Emily Williams, and we've sort of touched on this already, but it's an interesting question around, is there more that strategic marine planning can do? And in this instance, this question is around to ensure that that balance between climate and nature crises are addressed together. So that's specifically about that tension that we've already discussed. But I'm particularly keen on this. Is there more that strategic marine planning can do? And what are the panel's thoughts on what does that mean? What is strategic marine planning? You can tell I'm kind of self-interested in this as well, taking a bit of the chair's indulgence. But yeah, what is there to this? What more can be done, given that marine very nature is so different to land, it being such a dynamic environment and things like that. Anyway, I'll pull myself back because I'm not meant to be getting involved. I'm not on the panel. So who'd like to pick that up first? Anyone? Great, Helen, and then Jim. I think Jim was going to, so let's go Helen, Jim.
Yeah. I was going to be a little controversial, Mike, in terms of the joining up of the strategic position on the consenting and planning with the economic, to look at the long-term possibilities of everything being merged together so there is a true strategic plan rather than things running in parallel, and perhaps we'll end up bumping heads at the end and we're not. Nobody is getting what they really want out of it. That's my challenge that I'd throw back into the pot, really.
Thanks.
I think the answer to the question has to be inevitably, if it can't actually be, if it can't actually, something can't actually be done, it has to be really considered and why it can't be done. So I think that's the point I would make. So from a strategic perspective, there's no doubt that from a strategic perspective, something could be done. What is it? What actually would you do is more than what's already being done. And I think that's maybe the difficulty, that I would be a bit, you can probably tell I'm a wee bit bitty about it. I can get the point. I know I know what's trying to be put across, and I know there has to be something. But what I would say is that without any real analysis of what is being done, what is working, what approaches are planned, and what other things can be done, could I really give a fundamentally succinct answer to this? It's something that in my past life we considered, but I must admit that sometimes when it comes down to the trying to balance between the sort of the nature crisis and the climate crisis, it's quite a difficult subject. And it's not an easy answer. But what I would say is that there's no doubt with the current circumstances we're in, where we want to be, it's a point, actually, I would say that marine planning people should be asked. Not, I'm not a tall expert in this in any way, but I have heard it said many times. I just wonder what work is ongoing. It would be interesting to hear maybe a follow-up to that question, Mike, at some point from somebody involved in the in the detail of the current marine planning, what's gone before, and what's being considered and programmed for the future. I would be interested in that. Very interested from my strategic role in Csag, actually.
Thanks very much, Jim. Anyone else from the panel want to come in? We've got 5 minutes to go. So does anyone want to jump in on this? Otherwise, we can go again to the chat bar. Happy for me to, right, okay. Sorry, yeah.
I thought James was going to come in there. I've just got a kind of a small point just to raise in relation to this. It's important basically that the strategic and policy priorities that are agreed at a high level get translated into project advice. So it is quite a thorny topic, and the case officers and regulators have got a lot to weigh up. But where we have got policy priorities like a climate emergency, there needs to be some mechanism to inform project level advice, taking that policy priority into account.
Thank you, Ruth.
I agree with. I mean, there's policy implementation guidance now that's come out from the Welsh National Marine Plan. I know that our marine licensing team are working on using that to inform our advice. So that is happening in NRW at the moment. The difficulty is, I suppose, is that balance, and I'm not sure whether the current. Well, I think that the current Welsh National Marine Plan is trying to address that in a way. There are policies within that do cover both. It's just that it's just such a difficult balance to make. As Jim said, I'm not sure anybody really knows how you would do that next step. So it would be really worth having a discussion with the planners to see how that might happen. But I'm not a marine planner myself, so I can't answer it. But it's definitely a question worth raising.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I think this is probably the sort of last question time, and I think we've had a good tour around a lot of themes here, and we've managed to kind of stick to our brief as well around, you know, sort of policy and planning challenges, supporting ocean energy mitigation for climate change. We talked about climate, as well as the nature emergency. So just maybe final thoughts then, bringing it, this is quite specific, so we're bringing it down, but it's of local interest to Wales, clearly. So final thoughts from the panelists on this final question is, you know, from David, you know, with nearly 20 years of tidal energy demonstration projects, you know, more than 100,000 hours in the water, you know, why are we still struggling for evidence to support the marine licensing process? And so I guess before I throw it to you then, panel, yeah, what do you think is the root of why we're still grappling with the issue? Is it due to collaboration, or, you know, the sharing, or whatever it could be? So maybe a thought from each of the panel on why. And I don't mind who wants to go first. Anyone?
I'm happy to go first if you like.
Yes, thank you, Ruth.
My personal opinion, and this kind of comes from years of, probably about 15, 20 years of experience in working in this environment, is that it comes down to funding and therefore data ownership issue. So often projects have to collect their own data, but it is commercially sensitive for very obvious reasons, which takes me back to my one of my points in my presentation, is that funding for agreed research priorities will help make that information, and therefore the learning from it, more accessible to the industry as a whole. If you rely on projects to answer those specific questions, then it's always going to be an issue commercially about sharing that data.
Thanks, Ruth. So there we go. There's one challenge there already around data ownership and the sharing of. Any other thoughts from the panel before we wrap up?
I'd agree with Ruth. Sorry, Jim.
No, you, James. Go on.
I agree with Ruth. Yeah, the data sharing thing is an issue, but I think we got to remember that it's still a nascent industry in the UK. There are only a small number of devices in the water, and not many at all in Wales. Welsh waters have their own species and habitats that we're concerned about, and that we have to ensure that we protect. So there may be 100,000 hours in the water, but not in Welsh waters, and not always the monitoring information provided doesn't always meet our needs. So, you know, it might not be the right species, for example, or the right location, or there's always going to be a site-specific element, is what I'm trying to get at, that we have to address. It's not to say that we don't take that information on board. It's just that I'd still think we're in the really early stages of the industry. So there are still many uncertainties which we need to get to grips with, and we're doing our best to try and address them. So.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, I think that it's absolutely. I mean, I've spent a long time in this area of activity, and I think that the difficulty is my own personal view, taking account of everything that people have said, and the positions that Ruth and James are in, and how they do their business and what they understand. But it comes to the willingness. It's the willingness to accept the transferability. It's the willingness to accept what's best practice, and using your expert judgment based on that. And I think it comes back to the point I made earlier to Mike Williams, was it comes back to confidence and experience and the willingness to be able to adapt what's available, because we could wait a very long time to get sufficient site-specific information to be able to make the decision. So you've got to get a kickstart using, where you can, the most adaptable information to the circumstances. And I think I spent a long time trying to do that, and I know how difficult it is. And it is not a criticism of anybody or any process or any thinking, but I think that is actually the way that you have to start and be able to move things forward, in my opinion.
Thank you, Jim. Mike? Oh, you're on mute.
Just on that, is there where people don't actually have, people in the industry don't have their own levels of experience and confidence, can more junior people be given license by the more sagely experienced people to take more risk and you know, step up to that challenge?
Thanks, Mike. A good question there for further debate. Last words, because I know Manon's come back on, and so I know it's time. It's definitely last orders. We're ringing the bell. If you can remember what pubs were, but any more? Are we happy to wrap up? Okay. Well, look, thanks very much. It was good to squeeze every last second out of the session. So I know we sort of ended a bit abruptly there, but look, thank you ever so much to the panel members. Really good discussion and for answering all those questions. And thank you very much to the audience as well. They were coming through thick and fast, and there's good debate also happening, and good links as well up in that chat bar. Manon, I don't know if you're about to say what happens to this material next.
Yeah, will do. So just I want to say on behalf of the Marine Energy Wales team, thank you for a really interesting session and brilliant sharing from Mike as well. We're working really hard collaboratively with speakers on the session and others to progress our key policy areas of, especially around consenting and revenue support for the industry. So yeah, please go onto our website and see more of what we're doing. We've got some lot of activity, especially leading up to the Senedd election as well. So yeah, just wanted to reiterate that MEW is working hard on these policy areas for the industry. We've put quite a lot of the links in the chat today, and the session has been recorded as well, so we can share that later on. But again, thank you very much for joining us for this session today.
Great.